One or two people. Welcome to all of you to the next webinar from the Society for the Phenomenology of Religious Experience. I'm happy to see new faces and some old friends as well. That's wonderful. I'm Peter Costello. I'm from Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island. And today we're going to start talking about Husserl's Cartesian meditations. One thing we would ask is if you have not become a member of the Society for the Phenomenology of Religious Experience, that you please do that. I don't get any money. Olga doesn't get any money. As far as I know, no one gets any money from what we're doing. But the Society does run conferences and does have overhead costs. And so please, if you have not already signed up for a membership, please do that today. But you don't have to leave and go do it. It's just that it would be very helpful for us. We're a small society, but we have a lot of footprint, I think, lately. So what we'll
I have a
do,
question.
yes, Jeremy,
And you can't hear me, by the way. That's
I can
good.
hear you. Yeah.
I'm not 100% sure whether my membership is current or not. Is there a place I can look to check that?
Yeah, I can tell you right now you're $1,200 in arrears. You can just make it out to cash and send it to me. It's fine. Uh, Actually, just send an email to Olga and to me, and we'll find out.
Well,
Okay, great. Thanks.
can I give a footnote, Peter, quickly? We just have annual membership. So if you did not pay for 2025, and if you did not participate in the annual conference that we have, then it means that you should send something in. Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think all the information is at SoPheRE.org if you have not yet become a member. But thank you, Jeremy. That's helpful. All right. So what I'd like to do first is for us each to introduce ourselves briefly. Just say, your name, your affiliation, if you've been retired, your previous affiliation, your interest in this, and any background you may have had in phenomenology. We'll wait to talk about general questions after we've done our introductions, and I'll give a little overview of what to expect today. And before we leave, I'll ask you if there are 3 people who would be interested in presenting at the next webinar meeting. But I've already introduced myself. I'm Peter, and I'm in the philosophy department at Providence College. And I'm not sure if your screen looks the same as mine, but I'll just call on you and ask you to introduce yourself. Jeremy, can you go first, please?
Yes, Jeremy Smith. I've been retired for about a year from Otterbein University near Columbus, Ohio. My degree is actually in Comp Lit, and I taught English for 35 years, but I was able to incorporate a lot of philosophy and religion. That has always been my interest. And I've been studying phenomenology, yikes, since the 1980s. I studied with Jim Hart at Indiana University, who's still going strong. He's 88, but and I'm really glad that to have discovered SoPheRE. This is a really good connection for me with the kind of thing I want to continue to do.
Thanks, Jeremy. Sally, how about you?
Hi there, I'm Sally Stocksdale. I'm a historian, and I teach history at Towson University. And very interested, though, in phenomenology. I originally got involved with it because I decided that I thought that it was a way to try and help me understand history better.
Philip, how about you? Philip Goyle, you're muted.
You me? Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm Philip Goyle. I'm a theoretical physicist by training. I'm a professor of theoretical physics at the University at Albany. My primary interest is in the foundations of quantum theory. I basically want to understand in clear terms the nature of the reality that's so well described by quantum theory. And that's led me deeply into philosophy, into different parts of philosophy. And I've been particularly attracted to phenomenology because it seems to provide a conceptual framework for investigating quantum phenomena relatively unencumbered by metaphysical presuppositions that one might otherwise miss in one's discussion of quantum phenomena. And I have a collaboration with a phenomenologist, Harold Wiltshire, and my knowledge of phenomenology has been, I would say, quite scattered. It's been accumulated in a quite scattered, unsystematic way. So I'm joining this webinar as a way of bringing some systematic process to my learning.
Yorgos.
Yes, hello. I work on phenomenology at about 20 years now. I started with the relationship of Husserl and Heidegger, the Britannica article issue. Then my PhD is on Heidegger. It's something like an interpretation of being and time. And now I continue in a postdoctoral level and on research on body and phenomenology. I would like to read the text in a cautious, let's say, way. I don't know if I will have the time to do it properly, but I'm very interested in this.
Marvin.
Hello, I'm Marvin Moser. I worked for many years in software engineering, but in undergraduate school, I was very interested in philosophy, philosophy of mind, and also of logic. And when I went to graduate school, I initially thought I would study theoretical computer science and formal logic, but decided to become more practical, at least career-wise, and but continued my study of philosophy, both on the Western side, a bit of existentialism and postmodernism, but especially on Eastern philosophy, especially Buddhist philosophy, and did 3 years of intensive study and practice. And I see some at least high-level similarities in some of these approaches to understanding experience and mind, and I'm very curious and happy to be part of this group. Thank you for organizing it.
Ronnie, how about you?
Hi, my name is Roni Miron. I'm established at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. I've been studying early phenomenology, in particular the Husserl and the Munich-Göttingen circle. And I'm happy to be here.
Olga.
I'm Olga Louchakova-Schwartz, and I'm by training I'm a scientist and worked in medical science, cognitive science, neurophysiology, and I started this society actually in 2016 together with Peter and a group of other colleagues, because of the difficulties I had reconciling the toll of life that science takes in its experimentations with the absence of a coherent scientific theory. And that's what brought me to phenomenology. And then I was teaching phenomenology for several years. I'm interested in early phenomenology primarily, and just continue being active in research in both fields.
Christian.
Hi, I'm Cristian Mladin. I'm from Transylvania in Romania. I have a PhD in philosophy. Actually, I studied in Bucharest, Heidegger, with Gabrieli Cianu. I don't know if that's of any resonance, but maybe Cristian Ciocan and others who are quite known from Romanian phenomenological society. But this is far from me, so to speak. I'm currently the director of a quite special library, Batianeum Library, in Carlsberg or Alba Iulia. And I did not publish my thesis, and now I'm trying after 10 years to engage again and again. I didn't renounce studying phenomenology, mainly Husserl and Heidegger, but also the French phenomenology. And now maybe with some help, and I'm quite privileged and happy to be with you here, maybe I will start this great project to finish my thesis and publish it.
Christos.
My name is Christos Sideras. I'm originally a psychiatrist and sort of veered into therapy and philosophy. I've done a PhD in philosophy of emotions, and I have an interest in phenomenology insofar as it goes or comes deeper to our experience and understanding of it through it.
Mohammed.
Hi, everyone. I'm a computer scientist, and my work is my computer science research is in data management and blockchain, and the core problem that I study in computer science is the problem of consensus, the problem of agreement. And the last 5 years or so, I've been kind of looking into the philosophical aspect of agreement as it applies to ethics and morality. And I've also been a student of Sufism for many years, all my life. And so I've been studying Eastern philosophy and mystical tradition as well too. And also from phenomenological aspect as well, I've been studying as well too. So thank you for organizing this.
Evan.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Evan Underbrink. I am a doctoral student at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. I am working on research that focuses on Christian poetry and how it enters into the category of being divine, such as Dante's Divine Comedy, and what that means as a phenomenological category. I've been kicking around with SoPheRE and with phenomenology for about 5-6 years. Kind of since the start of the pandemic, started becoming a part of this group and other phenomenological groups. One of my main mentors here in this area is Father Justin Gable, who was a student of Drummond. So that's sort of my other link into phenomenology there. And I'm thoroughly excited to be with each and every one of you this day.
Julia.
Hello, I'm Julia Skrzynski. I did a phenomenology course with Peter at Providence College. I graduated from Providence in 2023, and then I got my master's in ancient Greek philosophy in Athens at the National and Kapodistrian University. And I've graduated from there recently, applied to a few PhD programs, gonna see where that goes, but I really enjoyed the phenomenology I did with Peter in college, and it's nothing like the ancient logic I primarily do, and so I find it interesting and I'm here to learn more about it.
Benjamin.
Hi, well, I'm Benjamin from Chile. I am a PhD student in philosophy. My work is mainly in phenomenological psychopathology, mainly depression, but a side interest for me has always been religious experience. So that's why I'm linked to, I met through emails, Professor Olga, and yeah, so that's how I got here by SoPheRE. So thank you for this place, like description, please.
Thank you all very much for introducing yourselves. I'm sorry I probably cut Christos off a little bit, but I didn't mean to. It's helpful for us just to get a sense of how we sound and who we are as we move forward. I'll just give you an overview of what we're going to do today, and then at the end ask for 3 people to maybe consider presenting. Julia will present today on sections 7 and 8. And so that hopefully will give you a sense for, the 15 or 20 minutes. Mostly today, though, I will be reading to you my section by section commentary on the first meditation. So I'll do, and I know I didn't say you had to read sections 1 and 2, but I'll talk from sections 1 through 6, ask for questions or comments, or you can contest what I say if you would like. That's fine too. Julia will present on sections 7 and 8, and she can let you talk with her about her account. And then depending on the time, we'll finish up with 9 through 11, where I'll read again the hopefully careful commentary that I've done. If we get all of that in 2 hours, we'll begin the second meditation next time in 2 weeks, and be looking for 3 people to do sections 15 and 16, sections 17 and 18, and sections 19 and 20. So 2 sections for each person to present. Again, the goal would be to do some graduate level work as if this were a seminar happening in person, and to be doing close textual work. Before I start to talk with you about how I find the meditations, I do want to mention I've been reading this a long time. The book I wrote on Husserl, The Layers in Husserl's Phenomenology, has as its real impetus a study of the Cartesian meditations that I did at Penn State, where I was a graduate student with a visiting professor from Israel, whose name Ronnie told me once, but I cannot remember. It's been a long time. But he really interested me in Husserl, and especially in the 5th meditation. So returning now to a commentary on the Cartesian meditations is like going back about 20 or 30 years for me, but it's helpful because I'm rediscovering a lot in it myself. I do think that this book is a very condensed, very important summary of transcendental phenomenology, and even in the first meditation, many of the insights of ideas 1 are already there. So I think this is a good book. I know Phillips has said this, and perhaps Marvin. People have said that they're coming to phenomenology in a way, in a new part of their studies. So this is very appropriate to begin a study of Husserl with, because I think it's one of the most systematic and readable ways that he presents it. So before we get started, though, and hopefully it would be brief, like maybe 5 minutes or so, do any of you enter into this discussion with particular questions that you would like to see answered over the course of these webinar episodes? Olga, yeah. I think you're muted, Olga.
Okay. Peter, I have something sitting on my mind. It bothered me for a while. Husserl has a way of getting at a problem from most general and kind of not defined definitions. And he talks about it in ideas that he starts with kind of more general talking, and then becomes very particular as he does analysis. So when he introduces the problematic of Cartesian meditations, he makes his way into evidence logically sort of gives general considerations. But then when he starts talking about evidence, he switches to perception. He didn't yet define intuition, but he transitions, it seems, in his argument of the need of the ground. The need of the ground is a logical argument. And then when he starts talking about perception, he talks about apodicticity. So, I mean, this is the same disconnect which exists in Aristotle for me when he talks about demonstrations, but before he introduces the way into apodicticity logically. I mean, human mind can switch these levels, but at the same time, I feel a little bit of the incoherence of the argument when this is done. And this was a problem all along. Like here we are reasoning, and then suddenly we are sinking into perception, and there seems to be no bridge. So that's the...
So, I mean, it's an important question. I won't be able to answer it now or perhaps in the entire month or two of the webinar. But what I can say is that you're not wrong, I don't think, to feel kind of a disconnect between the initial steps and the further steps of the meditations. And that's because for Husserl, logic arises out of experience. It's not done by a process of abstraction. And so, you know, you can see this later in Merleau-Ponty, who says that the category of color must come from the givens themselves. That same kind of thing is happening here. So, but we'll say I'm writing your thought and your question down, and I will try to address it as we go. Good. Anybody else have initial questions? That was very helpful. Yes, Christos.
I was sort of surprised that well, surprised or unsure because I haven't read all of it, but just the beginning of it. It seemed that he was sort of advocating for something rather systematic, or sort of a kind of Kantian type of synthesis of parts or disparate parts, sort of already parsed. And I found that a bit confusing because I thought that that he would have spoken of a unity of experience that differentiates. And anyway, I would like to understand a little bit more about his understanding of oneness or wholeness and parthood. And I know he talks about that elsewhere as well. So that I think that for me would be quite interesting. And the other thing that I'm personally interested in is flux or fluxion, or sort of movement and stillness, and the kind of thinking that goes along with that thinking and thought and so on.
Another great question that goes right to the heart of everything for him. Just so you know, the logical investigation on wholes and parts, I can't remember if it's 3 or 4, that is still valid within the Cartesian meditations in particular. So his earlier work on the logic of wholes and parts, again, he's going to find rooted in experience. Your emphasis on unity, or the question of unity, and also your question of flux are central to all of Husserl, but they also are central here. So again, I've written down what you've said, and I hope to be able to touch on it as we go. But I think, again, these questions are really helpful. If I know what you want to know, I can try my best to tailor it to you. Yes, Sally.
As I was reading the reading for today, I was confronted with a thought I had when I first began studying phenomenology, and that is, I mean, maybe I'm not understanding this right, but I just feel like there's an inbuilt contradiction in what he's saying. I mean, so on the one hand, he's saying, he's implying anyway, subjectivity, and yet he's searching for objectivity. Now, maybe that's a simplification, when I know that rather than objectivity, he's actually referring to apodicticity. I'm sorry, I mispronounced that. I know what the term means. Anyway, so I mean, I just feel like I'm confronted with that again. And so I want to finally put this to rest and understand if there is not a contradiction there.
Good. And I think, again, you're right to raise the question, what is the relation between subject and object, and what does that relation mean for Husserl? It will not mean what we tend to mean by it, right? So there will be no separation, and yet we will not be able to make metaphysical claims. So I think you're right. Is there a tension that remains once everything is immanent? How does transcendence get recognized if everything is within the subject? And so I think that's the key question for all of Husserl, and just like flux was, and just like the move from evidence to perception, I will say by way of anticipation that, and I have no doubt you know what apodicticity means. That's my little joke there. But anyway, that's the only joke you get for the whole time. But I think he is going to do something different in terms of adequate and inadequate evidence. And that connection with apodicticity is pretty profound for him. And it sets up everything else in the meditations. Jeremy.
I'd just like to second what Olga said, maybe and what you said, maybe from a little different point of view. I totally agree. This is an absolutely key issue in Husserl. And maybe he's doing some arguing, but intuition is not the conclusion of an argument. It's primary. And that is something that probably a great deal of philosophy doesn't fit into lots of other traditions. But I really agree. It's really key to Husserl, period.
I think you're right. And I think the style of argumentation is going to be very different. He says it multiple ways, but at one point he says experience is original consciousness, right? So experience is itself an argument. And so what we do when we're describing experience or intuition is we begin to realize that we don't have to make arguments to prove that solipsism is impossible, for example. In this book, that's going to be a big one. You don't make an argument to refute solipsism. You allow the intuition to come before you in a certain methodological way, and that intuition refutes solipsism as a possibility. And I'm only saying this as a way of anticipating again the thing that you're saying, which is that for Husserl, intuition is what we have in order to do phenomenology with. And so by way of intuition, we have to allow the arguments to surface. We don't construct them outside of experience and apply them to experience. So that's also very helpful, Jeremy. Christian, I saw you.
Yes, I'm really interested in seeing how reduction plays all along, because while looking quite superficially on the beginning of the text, I think the first paragraph, he says, first, anyone who seriously intends to become a philosopher must once in his life withdraw into himself and attempt, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. So from the beginning, reduction seems to work, and I'm curious if we could track reduction in his every step, mm-hmm. to see how this works and what the results are.
And especially in the steps that Julia is going to give us, because that's where it becomes clearer in these particular sections. That's good. Any other initial questions? That's very helpful, Christian. Philip, yes.
So I have a couple of questions, and these may be a little bit more specialized because of the place I'm coming from. But first of all, in physics, there's a tradition of phenomenology or phenomenological style of thinking going all the way at least to Mach. And in fact, Husserl, in one of his lectures, explicitly references Mach and phenomenology as coming from, the physicists, what the physicists are doing. And this has been enormously significant in the development of physics. In, for example, Poincaré's analysis of what we mean by two clocks being synchronized, and making a distinction between two clocks being synchronized when they're in front of us versus they're widely separated. making these very subtle distinctions. And it was crucial to the creation of quantum mechanics as well, like renouncing the idea of orbits of electrons around atoms, renouncing that idea. So one general question I have is how does Husserl's understanding of Epochean reduction, how does that relate to what the physicists are doing? In what sense does it go beyond it? How would he locate what the physicists are doing within his big conceptual framework? And that relates sort of to the idea that reduction can be by degrees. So in other words, you can go all the way back to the transcendental reduction, all the way back to transcendental consciousness, but you also can do it in a more moderate way. And what would those moderate intermediate steps look like? So that's one question. The second question is that I've noticed that, again, as a non-philosopher, that phenomenologists, and I've been to some conferences recently, tend to not look upon metaphysics very kindly as a discipline. That's my impression, and I could be wrong. So one of the questions I have is, how does Husserl view the enterprise of metaphysics and the kind of questions, the whole galaxy of questions that are in that discipline, like the primacy of objects versus events, or potential parts versus actual parts, these traditional metaphysical debates, how would he understand them? It's misguided or is significant? And again, where would they fit in? And the third is, I'm also a Buddhist meditator, so I'm curious about, when I read Husserl, I repeatedly see ideas which sound very close to ideas that I've encountered through Buddhist meditation and also experiences I've had in that context. So I'm again wishing to understand better what that relation is, because that's rather intriguing for me. Thank you.
Yeah. Just very briefly, unless Ronnie, you want to respond to Philip's questions.
No.
Okay. So I won't be honestly of much help with respect to physics because I know very little, especially about quantum physics. If I have to let go, for example, of the idea of electrons going into orbit, I don't know what I'll do. Mostly a joke, but not fully a joke. I can, however, speak to where I think you might want to go to look for answers about that, and that is to the work of David Morris in Canada. He would be the person who would be most likely to give you answers to that kind of question that you asked. As far as metaphysics, I think you'll see even in the Cartesian meditations that unlike how some people and some very good interpreters read Husserl, Husserl is committed to doing metaphysics, in my view. In fact, you'll see 2 points of metaphysics come up in the Cartesian meditations. The first is the absolute existence of the transcendental ego, and the second is the absolute existence of the other as alien other. Those 2 points are metaphysical points that he realizes. So it would be untrue to say that phenomenology brackets all of metaphysics for the province of meaning, although Husserl will sometimes speak that way, right? That we're going to bracket the question of being in order to pursue the eventfulness or the origin of sense or Sinn or of meaning, Bedeutung, right? But I think he really does resist the kind of all or nothing approach that many commentators have of him. And it will be my hope that as a group and personally at me, that we can provide a reading of Husserl that is very sensitive to that both and, as opposed to a very sharp distinction. But I want you to carry that question forward with us as we go, because I think it's really important. Ronnie.
I think it is connected to the question of Yorgos, in connection with the affinity with the theory of whole and parts, which is mostly recognized as an representing a realistic accentuation on the part of Husserl. And I actually many of the realist phenomenologists relied on this theory, and of which he never cut off from this theory throughout all his career. So my question, or I would say special interest in reading Husserl is actually to challenge this quite robust view in this literature that view him as a transcendental idealist, and in that way to find marks or signs or whatever that manifest his interest. He's actually a rather realist, although mostly implied interest, and in that way to enable, to initiate discourse on Husserl's metaphysics.
Excellent. So Ronnie, you and I will probably be going at him from different standpoints, right? So my standpoint is to show him to be a rigorous transcendental idealist of the kind that resists easy characterization with respect to metaphysics. So you should feel free to push back and to, make.
I don't see any contradiction between the
Yeah.
two, because I think that to be a strict transcendental idealist requires so much, I would say, metaphysical passion that eventually arrive at the same point.
I think that's right. And for those people who are approaching Husserl anew, he's often associated with a saying to the things themselves, zu den Sachen selbst, right? He doesn't really say that explicitly in that particular way, in the way that people act as if he, is waving a flag and saying it very often. He comes close in the ideas, he comes close in these other things to saying that, but he means it, right? He means that we are able to and focused our attention on knowing the things as they appear. So we get to the thing. We don't deal with representations or images or mental pictures. Like we deal with the things. So there is definitely a realist approach that he is doing. All right. So we ready to begin? Yorgos, last one. Go ahead.
Yes. I would like to ask if there is any comments about as you can see, I'm Greek. I'm not English. I don't have. But is there any comments about the translation? I mean, to start with it, because. For example, the Sache is translated like affair, which was a little bit strange for me. But also, I see that he changes a lot the phrases in a way that it's better for someone to understand it, but it's something like a radical change. If someone or you, Mr. Costello, have something to say about the translation and how is it?
I mean, when there come, at least as far as I consider it helpful, when there are issues in the translation that I think we should talk about, I will certainly mention them. Levinas's French is good. I would say, that's also an option for you. It's going to be weird, just like the English translation of Ideas 1 is weird by saying that Leibniz translates into mental process. I mean, just that one translation can ruin English readers of Husserl forever, right? So there are issues in this. Cairns is pretty good overall, I think. It doesn't mean that it shouldn't be updated, but he's not bad. Animate organism for Leib is an odd choice. It's unfortunate that Cairns was writing it as phenomenology was just beginning to grow in English. And so we do need updated text, but I don't think overall that most of the English work is going to prevent people from understanding what he's going through. That being said, German is not my first, second, third, or even fourth language, so I'm not the greatest. There are other people here who are more qualified. And I think in particular questions after like a group of sections is announced, questions as to the translation would be welcome. So I don't want you to feel like I'm cutting it off, but I also think it won't be my focus to clarify. And welcome to Emin. We introduced ourselves very briefly. I'm about to start going through the sections with my commentary. But if you could just introduce yourself very briefly, that would be very helpful.
All right. I'm audible, right?
Yes, I hear you.
Hello. Yeah. My name is Mohammed Amin. I'm from Kerala, India. And I study my master's in JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. And my interest in Husserl is generally, I'm interested in phenomenology, and also my thesis, master's thesis on Heidegger's ontotheological critique of Western metaphysics. So I wanted to understand, because he's a student of Husserl and also he's coming from phenomenological tradition. So I wanted to understand what Husserl's understanding of metaphysics and source, all of the and I read Husserl in the last semester, but it was from very Indian philosophical sense. Vedanta, and I think it's very bad interpretation in many senses. So I wanted to understand a little bit better. So that's it.
Excellent.
Thank you.
So, welcome to everyone. And I know that some people are in different time zones, perhaps radically different in India, Romania, different places. And so I would appreciate the fact that it could be a very different time for you there. I'm going to start reading my commentary, and then after I get through section 6, we should have time for questions before we go to Julia for her presentation of 7 and 8. And then again, perhaps we'll have time for 9 through 11. If we don't, then we'll start with that next time. It's almost the anniversary of the lectures that Husserl gave in France. February 23rd and 25th in 1929 were the lectures that he gave at the Sorbonne, out of which these come. In attendance was Emmanuel Levinas and Merleau-Ponty, to name at least two people who would have heard and read the things that you are hearing and reading. So I know that I didn't ask you to read the introduction, but I'm going to start there. So if you have the English or the German or whatever version, you might want to turn to sections 1 and 2. And again, I'm just going to go read through section 6. And then we can break for questions, and then we'll see. Yes, Ronnie, go ahead.
If you can, you use this.
Yes. Yes.
So if you refer to a specific page, can you please indicate?
That I anticipate doing that. Yes, I will.
Thank you.
You know, every time I make a quote, I will tell you what page it's on in that version. You should also have the link to that version that I've sent out. I'm not sure how the PDF will translate in terms of page numbers. I hope it will give you the page number. So let's turn to section 1. From the very beginning of the lectures, within this introduction, and you can hear me, right? Everyone can hear me? Husserl specifies that he is indebted to Descartes and the Meditations on First Philosophy as, quote, an already developing phenomenology. That's on page 1. This is despite the fact that immediately after acknowledging Descartes, Husserl says he must, quote, reject nearly all the well-known doctrinal content of the Cartesian philosophy. Again on page 1. What are we to make of this almost backhanded compliment? On the one hand, Descartes began to talk about consciousness as immanent. The very distinction between immanence and transcendence, and the problem of transcendence being located within consciousness, is something that Descartes identified. Such well-known figures as the evil genius and the idea of the infinite or the idea of God are testimony to Descartes' identification of the problem. On the other hand, Descartes did not, as Husserl said as early as Ideas 1, grasp the epoche as the main tool necessary to do justice to consciousness as such. Descartes, instead of epoche, developed doubt and the presupposition of the separation of the mind and the world. It is that presupposition that the mind and world are separate, and the related assumption that the mind is simply identified with the self-aware subject, as opposed to being a transcendental field, a functioning transcendental field, in which subjects and objects come to be distinguished. It is this that delays transcendental phenomenology from arriving on the scene. Nevertheless, Husserl compels us to return to Descartes and reread the Meditations on First Philosophy. He says the Meditations have a, quote, guiding idea, still on page 1, which according to Husserl is the, quote, complete reforming of philosophy into a science grounded on an absolute foundation. So that's the good thing that he's drawing from Descartes. To have philosophy reformed is also to have it serve as the ground and legitimacy of all other sciences. The historical development of science, then, has led it to further into method and practice without clarity as to the ontological and epistemological absolutes which would justify this method. So things must be rebuilt, and this is on page 2. Quote, hence the need for a radical rebuilding that satisfies the idea of philosophy as the all-inclusive unity of the sciences within the unity of such an absolutely rational grounding. End quote. So again, he's going along with Descartes. He's drawing out the project without drawing out the doctrine. So that should be symbolic for us going forward. At stake in Descartes, as Husserl reads him, is the answer to the question of the possibility of rational knowledge of the absolute. If we cannot have absolute insights on which any given science relies, then we are forever within the realm of mere predictability. I sometimes use this example with my students, undergraduate students. I tell them that triangles aren't real because they're two-dimensional, perfect, mathematizable objects that don't exist in a bumpy life world for Husserl, and that they should be a little bit uncomfortable with the fact that architects use triangles in order to build buildings that so hopefully will hold up. That kind of disconnect between the radically mathematizable and the radically bumpy, irregular life world is what Husserl is getting into here. The crisis doesn't come until 1938, the crisis of the European sciences by Husserl, but he is already thinking about it. For Husserl, axioms are constructs and not absolutes, and they would forever compromise the science that relies on them unless they pointed to a certain set of concepts that would ground them within their region. Insofar as the hoped for absolute concepts and absolute method would come from the experience of knowing itself, apart from any particular act of knowing in relation to any particular thing or region of things, Husserl notes that Descartes makes a turn, again on page 2, quote, toward the subject. This turn happens, again a quote, at two significant levels. The turn to the subject is important for Husserl to acknowledge because Husserl's own transcendental phenomenology turns toward the subject, though the turns, Descartes' and Husserl's, will not be identical. At the first of the two levels, Descartes' turn is toward the private, the singular. The subject that he turns to is in each case mine. In doing so, according to Husserl, Descartes admits a certain kind of Socratic beginning. This is on page 2. Quote, I have thereby chosen to begin in absolute poverty with an absolute lack of knowledge. I call that Socratic because Socrates says, I know that I don't know. That for him, the science of philosophy is in a way the science of ignorance. This beginning in poverty allows Descartes to aim at, quote, a method for going on. Again, page 2. Beginning in privacy and poverty, then, is necessary only in order to leave my particular or my singular self behind for a method, quote, that promises to lead to genuine knowing. That's again, page 2. It is method that will reconstitute or baptize me into a new, less poor self. At the second of the two levels, Descartes' turn to the subject is toward the, quote, ego as subject of his pure cogitationes. That's page 3. It is at the level of my essentiality, my purity, that I engage in Descartes' meditations. No longer Peter, but pure ego. This pure ego is something that Descartes arrives at by way of, quote, regress and doubt, page 3. Something in my power as Peter allows me to encounter myself stripped away of limits and particularities. I, as Peter, can be, quote, radically consistent and aim at, quote, absolute knowledge. This means that I can reject or set aside everything that I can doubt. And I can doubt because I can see no way to value or begin from my particularity as Peter, as this embodied limited being that gets lots of things wrong. So I accept neither my body, nor my sense experience, nor the world. This is on page 3. Quote, accordingly, the being of the world must remain unaccepted at this initial stage. So I think it was Christian who wanted to know where epoche and reduction begin. It begins on page 3. Right? So you're really beginning without thematizing the beginning. I only accept myself then as that which can engage in, quote, solipsistic philosophizing. That's on page 3. I was poor as Peter. Believe me, poor. Now I find myself enriched by purity and method. I cut myself off. I am a solipsist. But that is not lonely, for my emotions, as Peter, are not absolute knowing. And the world, which I can be wrong about, is not accepted. Whatever others are for me is unclear. So, by the way of this epoche, I will not engage with them. This radical consistency and radical break with the impoverished self and the uncertain world allows me to seek, as Sally said, quote, apodictically certain ways by which, within my own pure inwardness, an objective outwardness can be deduced. This is page 3. This is mostly Descartes, because the problem of deducing objectivity from immanence is not Husserl's, right? I am looking, as Descartes tells me I can, for the transcendence within immanence, as a transcendence that is deduced from the absolute that I am. Holding on to the method of deduction is, of course, the whole problem, as is the privileging of the subjective over the objective and the failure to recognize givenness. That's really the essential thing for Husserl, and the interplay of noesis and noema, which he wrote about in Ideas 1, 10, 15 years earlier. This is why Husserl reforms Descartes, and it is why the fifth meditation will show how solipsism is neither methodologically fruitful nor epistemologically justified. In Husserl's hands, the turn to the subject will be the turn to intersubjectivity and the interplay between the living object, which he says we experience or intuit in person, leibhaftig, and the lived body, the Leib, that intuits. That's for the future. Section 2. Husserl now asks the methodological question that will guide his treatment of Descartes through the meditations. Is it worthwhile to search for, quote, some clarifiable core that might infuse our time with living forces? Page 3. It is important that Husserl seeks living forces, lebendige Kräfte. There must be an organic quality to the insights that we gain. They must, as it were, grow on their own and suggest a telos, teleological quality. Any living thing shows itself on the way to its fullest, mature, and possibly reproductive self. If phenomenology is to be a living science, should we be looking to Descartes? The historical situation in which we find ourselves with respect to the sciences, Husserl says, is one of internal conflict. This will be on page 4. They, the sciences, quote, are now feeling themselves greatly hampered by obscurities in their foundations, in their fundamental concepts and methods. This, of course, is the message of Husserl's later work, The Crisis of the European Sciences. The sciences have not listened to Descartes, and Descartes' lack of self-criticism with respect to the deductive method allowed for mathematizability to overcome meaningful critique. Brain functions, for example, accompany meaning functions. But the point of conversion from the brain function into the meaning function is unclear. That does not stop the pharmaceutical industry from exponential expansion of its reductive practices, but it should for Husserl. Such sciences are not alive in the sense Husserl seeks. They are expanding, but they are ungoverned by telos. By contrast, he says that Descartes, in the Cartesian method of approach to the subject, is so governed, as it, and this is on page 4, quote, seems to be striving, hinzustreben, towards some necessary final form, where in its true sense, and that of the radical transmutation itself might become disclosed. A living thing strives toward a final form. And there is some life in transcendental subjectivity that can address the obscurities that bother the existing sciences. Husserl now goes into a history of Western academic life, which includes the decline of, quote, religious belief, on page 4, and the surge and then decline of science. And not just of science, but of philosophy, which no longer is, quote, carried on with a consciousness of responsibility. That's page 5. What are we beholden to in philosophy? If we believe the ways in which philosophy is practiced prior to phenomenology, we are not responsible to each other, or to truth, or to a coherent and fruitful view of what demands to be recognized. For Husserl, there are too many philosophies and too many philosophers. We are within the realm of the particular, of the singular. We are not within the realm of the mutual, the cooperative, the shared path. We are not taking a stand on the rational, but on the absolute poverty of the initial person cut off from the world and from one another without the hope of consistent living method. Whatever Husserl is about to do then, he is signaling to us as readers that he wants to restore, quote, the radicalness of philosophical self-responsibility. It's page 6, where what he means by self is multiple. Oneself, responsibility for oneself, and the self of philosophy. It is toward the transcendental ego that Husserl aims, but with the goal to, again on page 6, quote, uncover thereby for the first time the genuine sense of the necessary regress to the ego. Why do we need to go back to the ego, and what does it mean? All right, so now I'm going to start on 3. I'll read from 3 to 6, and we'll break for questions or discussion, and then we'll have Julia continue with 7 and 8. Section 3. Our first move, Husserl says, is to, quote, put out of action, außer Spiel zu setzen, all the convictions we have been accepting up to now. That's page 7. We are keeping a guiding idea of, quote, an all-embracing science, but that is only, quote, at first. So again, I think Olga was talking about for her, the disconnect between evidence and then intuition. It may feel like a disconnect, but he is upfront telling us we're only keeping the guiding idea of Descartes' all-embracing science at first. We're not really going to start with science. We're going to start with subjectivity. The first question for Husserl is indeed how to presuppose such a guiding idea. Descartes, Husserl says, presupposed a whole logic within the guiding idea. And Descartes' guiding idea or ideal, quote, this is page 7, the ideal approximated by geometry and mathematical natural science. And this has not clarified for us the meaning of scientific practice or its relation to lived experience, I think is what Philip, you were talking about. We cannot, for example, say why buildings whose blueprints are done in straight lines and triangles hold up the bumpy material that they are meant to structure. We know that they predictably do, but we do not know the relation between mathematics and life. Descartes took over the idea of philosophy as the idea of a deductive system according to axioms, and the subject, the ego, played the role of the axiom. This is on page 8. Quote, the axiom of the ego's absolute certainty of himself, along with the axiomatic principles innate in the ego, end quote. How the ego could be an axiom is something Descartes did not clarify. So Husserl emphasizes that he does not begin with a, quote, normative ideal, page 8, of science as a deductive or inductive science. He rather searches for an ideal, quote, we produce, again, page 8. What he keeps is quote, the general aim of grounding science absolutely. He keeps this only as a question. He does not decide yet whether it is possible to have and to keep this aim. What he wants, though, is what is, quote, intrinsically first. Page 8. How will we know what is intrinsically first? By finding it as given. And it would be worthwhile to just dwell on what givenness is for Husserl, the fact that we are encountering what is always already soliciting our view, right? So givenness is something central to phenomenology. Thus, we arrive in a somewhat muted way at the beginning of phenomenology with the given. Husserl claims, again on page 8, quote, we get the general idea of science from the sciences that are factually given. The word given is not a throwaway. We experience the existing sciences and they offer their guiding or general idea, quote, in a state of indeterminate, fluid generality. Again, page 8. How is the guiding idea of the sciences we experience given? As indeterminate, fluid generality. In one sense, this seems not to be very helpful. Like indeterminate fluid generality just seems to say like they're making it up as they go along. However, in another sense, it is very helpful. We are limiting ourselves to what is given in the manner or the how of its givenness. An indeterminate fluid generality, and I can't remember who mentioned the flux, it might have been Christos, is like a stream of water or perhaps of internal time. And as such a stream, it, the guiding idea, as given in the sciences, has its own manner of appearance. It makes a claim as to its meaning. This givenness in this form, Husserl says, is a, quote, precursory presumption. Moving from presuppositions to a presuppositionless science, and that's what he wants phenomenology to be, a presuppositionless science, takes time. We must become accustomed to the notion of givenness and the interplay between our consciousness and what is given in the manner in which it is given. So what I'm suggesting is that even in looking at how the guiding idea of science is given to us by means of these historical sciences, we can find something about the way in which givenness for Husserl is cashed out. Okay, section 4. Husserl wants to make the indeterminate fluid generality of the guiding idea of science, quote, distinct, page 9. He can do so, he says, only if we do not assume that the sciences we actually experience are in fact the same as, quote, sciences in the true and genuine sense. The factual sciences, quote, involve a claim, page 9, to being true sciences. But science as an idea occurs as, quote, still undisclosed. This is all page 9. I think this part of the translation, to speak to Yorgos's point, is something I can't find in the German. I looked in there and I didn't see still undisclosed, right? I think it's true, but I don't think it's actually in there. So I will say the claim that the factual sciences have to being true obfuscates whether or not they are true sciences in the form of the genuine idea. In order to witness the guiding idea, we must immerse ourselves, still on page 9, einzuleben, live into, right? Live within, in what they are trying or striving, streben, to do. This will help us to more, quote, clearly and distinctly see what is being aimed at. So I'm highlighting this notion of immersion or living within because we have a living science that he wants, and we ourselves are living, and so we live within the science in order to draw out the guiding idea from the experience as we live it. We're not from the top down. Like we're not looking at mice running around in a maze and declaring what it is that they're doing. We're living in the science and sort of allowing the guiding idea to present itself. Far from treating the factual sciences as mice in a maze, we enter into the sciences and live within them. We witness their striving as if our own. We feel their striving. It is this that allows clarity and distinctness. It is within the immersion or living within that, quote, the constituent parts of the general final idea, genuine science, become explicated for us. That's on page 9. Notice the way in which explication works. The idea presents itself in its explication for us as a return on our investment. We live in and toward the idea. We invest ourselves within the striving of the sciences, and the idea moves itself towards us. It rewards our living within. What we witness within any of the factual sciences, Husserl says, is, quote, judicative doing, or judgment. I think this is page 10. We see the distinction between immediate and mediate judgments. We live the way in which the science strives for grounded judgments. A truth that is judged and maintained as, quote, an abiding acquisition is one that we call appropriately within that science, quote, a cognition, erkenntnis, knowledge. It's page 10. We also witness within the acquisition of a cognition the appearance of evidence. Evidence is the ability judgments have to, quote, show themselves, erweisen sich, as correct, as agreeing. This is on page 10. And as allowing the one who judges to experience, quote, a judicative having of such and such itself. See selbst. The agency of the judgment as proving itself or showing itself, the permission it gives us to experience the judicative having, or the having in consciousness, is an important manner of description. Our judgments, quote, adjust, richtet, and by means of our act of judging, allows what is judged to give itself more fully as we take the time to synthesize. This is between page 10 and 11. Quote, this conversion is inherently characterized as the fulfilling of what was merely meant, a synthesis in which what was meant coincides, Deckung, and agrees with what is itself given. That's a quote. There is power of interaction between judging and judged in which there is a kind of mutual agency. So this is my interpretation of what's happening here. You don't have to agree, but this is what I think phenomenology does. The judgment adjusts, the judged offers and displays itself. The grounding of judgments occurs within the experiential interplay of noesis, judicative doing, and noema, judging as judged. To be grounded within the synthesis of overlaying, Deckung, that names experience, the synthesis of subject and object, is in fact, quote, the ideal goal of science. Husserl ends this section by distinguishing between predicative and pre-predicative judging and evidence. Why would he do this? He wants again to help us see that science cannot rest simply on an active and self-aware manner of investigation. Givenness and the immersion that we live within givenness is total and occurs as lived experience before any cognition. Quote, predicative includes pre-predicative evidence. That's page 11. We do not only judge when we are aware of the subject and the predicate and our power of linking them together through the copula, S is P. We also judge pre-predicatively. Our irritation at the noise in the street while we're in a webinar is a pre-predicative judgment before we recognize that we are irritated and that the car noises are what is irritating. This means that we will always have to keep an eye on, what we will have to keep an eye on is our own power and practice of turning from pre-predicative judgments, lived as such, toward describing or naming or formulating judgments in language. Experience occurs prior to expression. In that case, predication, the act of linking a subject and object in language, must bear its own attention. This is on page 11. Quote, the expression as such has its own comparatively good or bad way of fitting, eigene bessere oder schlechtere Anpassung, what is meant or itself given. and therefore has its own evidence or non-evidence, end of quote. So this fitting is this en passant. This notion of what is fitting for the expression of the judgment is also not to be passed over quickly. What is fitting in terms of expression is not new to Husserl as a concern either. It receives a great deal of space in the Ideas, all 3 volumes. The having of the judged itself, in its self-evidence, in its self-givenness, is only part of the guiding idea of science. Another part is the, quote, evidence of expression, page 11. Judgments cannot be grounded well or absolutely unless they receive the expression that they are calling for. A lot depends on how we frame and express judgments. Section 5. We are doing Cartesian meditations, Husserl says, because the de facto sciences are, quote, striving toward universality. It's page 11. And as such show their desire for, quote, an absolute foundation. Again, 11. The striving is itself the judgment that foundation is needed. So the striving is the judgment. The notion of evidence that such an absolutely grounded science would operate with is, quote, an experiencing, Erfahrung, of something. That's page 12. This experiencing as evidence, quote, is precisely a mental seeing of something itself. Es selbst geistig zu Besicht gekommen. I don't know that I would put mental there as a way of rendering the translation, but it is a seeing of something itself. When the thing shows itself to me, when it becomes seen, gekommen, Besicht, that is when we have the experience that is useful as evidence. So Sally's earlier concern of what is this tension? What is this contradiction? Like, this doesn't go away. This is the very connectedness of subject and object. We do not proclaim from above what we discover by means of experience. Quote, perfect evidence and pure and genuine truth become given, page 12. They are given as ideas within, quote, the striving for knowledge, for fulfillment, page 12 again. The very idea of perfect or full evidence, then, is not manufactured by me, but rather lived as what I am searching for. I intend a fulfillment of my intention, but that fulfillment is not able to be produced by me. And here I think is the key that might be helpful to Olga. I live toward evidence. Within a scientific attitude, I seek out or strive for, quote, verifications of a new kind, that's page 12, that have validity once for all and everyone. I know in advance that I may not achieve perfect evidence or the kind of verification that I seek. Nevertheless, I am reconciled, quote, to an infinite horizon of approximations, again on 12, as I tend toward the new kind of verification. So Philip's discussion of how one model of what's happening in atoms gets replaced for another model, like the people who discovered the model where the electrons are circulating might be a little bit depressed that their model no longer works, but they would in advance know that we're really trying to approximate what it is that's happening in the world. And I get better at moving toward absolute evidence by way of approaching the given as given. I get better at it because I begin to see a shape to any particular science. It moves, quote, from intrinsically earlier to intrinsically later cognitions, end quote, page 12, that arise within their flow or progression because of, quote, the nature of things themselves, der Sachen selbst. So there, as Ronnie was saying, this push towards the real in Husserl. Science thus answers to what is given, both in the things that it studies and in the progression of its method and its cognitions. When we live in the science as a practice of knowledge, we see that the final idea of science, the goal of genuine and absolutely grounded science, quote, governs that striving. That's on page 13. So, we're not just saying with Descartes, oh, people are wrong a lot. Let's, let's just find some absolute ground. Husserl is saying, you're trying for a presuppositionless science, you're trying for the absolute ground, because from within the science, you can see that that's the goal that science is seeking on its own terms. Science itself leads itself toward the final idea because of the way in which its striving is tied to the things themselves. It has an answerability to the process of experience. We are not looking for a logic. Logic is under the epoche. We do not take sentences that we write, thoughts we have, sciences in which we engage, and then abstract out a set of rules that they are already living by. Rather, we proceed towards an experience of what governs them the way we proceed towards something we do not quite see yet, an item in the fog as we are on a boat in a lake. We thus arrive by not jumping toward logic as, quote, a first methodological principle. That's page 13. That principle is that I cannot make any judgment, quote, that I have not derived from evidence from experience, in which what I judge about, quote, are present to me as they themselves. This is page 13. So if we're to have a first methodological principle, it is that I have to express and know and put together in a systematic way the way in which things present themselves to me, the way in which they move towards me or call for my expression. The only way for something to be present to me in my judgment is as, quote, they themselves, sie selbst, as self-giving. What I judge about must have agency and give itself to me in just this way that I am judging. Our power of expression must therefore be thoroughly critiqued. Its critique is this: what we say must in some very simple yet very powerful way reveal the self-giving character of what is known. This criteria seems almost impossible. How do we get the agency and the self-revelation of the state of affairs of the Sache into a language that I speak, but that the thing does not necessarily speak? Right? So the quarks or whatever aren't going, hey, let's formulate this science as a, whatever. They're not talking to me in the language that I am speaking about them. Right? We must seek, quote, a new legitimation of significations. That's page 14. This legitimation comes from attaching new expressions to ones that already work, or, quote, accrued insight. Page 14. What is more, we also need to work by way of the past sets of expressions towards, quote, a fixing of words. Page 14. This last part, the fixing of words, seems quite difficult. If this is the ideal science that Husserl is working toward, like especially in English, we have words like love or living or whatever. How are you going to express things that can be fixed? It seems a very difficult proposition for a philosopher who is trying to have philosophy as a science to guide all the other sciences. How are you going to fix the terminology of the philosophy, first and foremost? And how will we tell what these foundational insights or critical experiences are? We will know them, Husserl says, because they, quote, bear the stamp of fitness for such a function, den Stempel solcher Berufes. I have to forgive my German pronunciation. It's awful. I only know how to read, right? Stempel, this stamp. This stamp must be born in themselves, an sich tragen. This is page 14. They must already bear the stamp. That is, we didn't put it there. They must show the stamp as evidence of their priority. They must be stamped as, quote, preceding all other imaginable evidences. Like we're literally looking for the first critical foundational experiences and things in a science. And they must show themselves to be that. They must inspire confidence in starting with them. More, they must permit us to be certain of them. Quote, this is page 14, they must carry with them, mit sich führen, an absolute certainty. Certainty, then, is not a mode of my self-comportment only. It is a comportment of ours that we find possible because the thing brings it toward us as our possibility. Section 6. Husserl now moves into what will be an extremely important series of distinctions with respect to evidence. When we have perfect evidence in which we have the thing itself as it gives itself to us, we have the capacity for absolute certainty and absolute indubitability. In most cases of our lives, however, prior to the establishment of transcendental phenomenology as a science of meaning, we only have imperfect evidence. We have a table in view as a whole, but we only really have a slice or a side or a perspective in our line of vision. We can run our hand over a part of it to determine its smoothness, but we can only run our hand over one part at a time. Thus, we are given the whole by means of and through the side or the adumbration. This does not mean that the experience of the table is invalid or illusory. Rather, it means that the evidence we have of the table, or indeed of anything that operates by means of perspectival slices or adumbrations, is always and essentially imperfect and incomplete. Our experience of the table, in other words, is, this is page 15, quote, infected with unfulfilled components, with expectant and attendant meanings. What we need to do with that which is yet to be fulfilled in its totality is to commit to, quote, again, page 15, a synthetic course of further harmonious experiences in which these attendant meanings become fulfilled in actual experiences. To become more fully responsible for the way I see and act with the table, I walk around it, feel across it, push against it with my weight, try to rock it back and forth to see if it is level with the floor. As I do so, I begin to see that what I will get with respect to the evidence of the table that I am already given as a whole is, quote, adequate evidence, page 15. We say something like this in ordinary language. As I test out the table, I find it adequate for my needs to put a series of boxes or books on. But adequate evidence is not quite what the absolutely grounded science needs. We need apodictic evidence. We need to have evidence that we cannot gainsay. And this means that we look not to adequate or inadequate evidence, but to another type of evidence altogether. We need principles that cannot be doubted. And it is the apodictic insights or principles that have the highest, quote, dignity, page 15, according to Husserl. The apodictic evidence will never turn out to be doubtful or untrue. And this is contrary to the adequate evidence of the table. The table may, over time, warp or rot. It may not always be adequate as a table. But apodicticity is, quote, the absolute unimaginableness, this is page 16, of non-being, and thus excluding in advance every doubt as objectless, empty. The principle of the correlation of noesis and noema, for example, for Husserl, is apodictic. The correlation is apodictic. The insight into the correlation is apodictic. What is our task now? Well, we are, Husserl says, to, quote, bring out evidences, page 16. The German is aufweisbar sein, which is more passive. Whether these evidences that are apodictic can be demonstrable. Can they demonstrate themselves? Can they? The apodictic evidence that we begin with may be inadequate, and this will be key for our understanding of our experience of other people. Right? We will have apodictic, yet always inadequate evidence of other people. But if they are inadequately fulfilled, these evidences, quote, would have to possess at least a recognizable apodictic content. That's page 16. All right, so that's through section 6, at least the commentary that I had prepared. Why don't we take 5 minutes or 10 minutes and discuss or ask questions or whatever you would like to do before we get to Julia. Olga.
So I just want to precede what I want to say with saying that I rely on evidence. I studied Husserl's theory of evidence. I wrote about it, etc. So I'm with it. However, what if there is a thing out there is not cannot be evidenced, like in quantum physics or in brain processes. And what happens in that case when you cannot really pinpoint the genetic aspect of knowledge? That's question number one. When there is no possibility to build a reliable evidence, when there is no possibility of fulfillment, at least by means of sensory intuition, you know. So that's one situation. And the other situation is, again, and I'm playing devil's advocate because these are just the questions that I struggle with myself. The new things in science, they really appear through disruptions. The intuition in this case becomes group-wise unreliable. And then there is somebody who works kind of, who sees incoherences in this intuition and then comes with a new knowledge. So the question is, do you think that, or better to say, by which means do we construct knowledge when intuition is inadequate, which it tends to be when we are speaking about groups?
So the way I can initially think to say something to this, and other people can also respond or ask their own questions if they'd like. I was just teaching the Public by Plato, and for a long time I thought that the guardians were a fairly large group of people who would be philosophical and also bodily fit to defend the laws and the ways of life of the Republic. But in Book 6, Plato says there will be or Socrates says there'll be very few of them, which caused me to rethink my whole understanding about how this was proceeding. I think that, for example, discussing what justice is a very difficult thing to do. It's a very difficult thing to begin and to proceed apodictically with absolute certainty. Somewhat like there'll be very few guardians, there may be very few, maybe only one science that will begin and maintain itself by means of apodictic insights in its genesis, in its origin. And that may very well be that phenomenology is the only science that will begin and maintain itself in that way. And I think if that's true, and I have a feeling that is true for Husserl, then that's okay, because phenomenology then maintains the right to critique all of the existing sciences that are not it as they go through their methodological growth that they are striving for. So I don't know what other people who have more experience than I do of science and of phenomenology think, but that's where I think he's going. Like, as long as you have, just like Tart was saying, as long as you have one fixed point, you can then go back and redo everything. As long as phenomenology is the decider for what counts as apodictic evidence and is the decider for the structure of science as such, all of science can be deductive or inductive, can be only able to be progressively approximatory or predictable. Like, that will be okay. And I think we see that the sciences are like that anyway. So this is what I actually think he's doing. Marvin.
I have a question in reading it and listening to your commentary. Thank you. It seems like Husserl has, in his bracketing or suspension, going back to first principle, he's overlooked the concept of time. Like how if we're bracketing everything, then why not bracket memories, for example, and this whole idea of the predicative and you know, it all has time time functions and somewhat of a logic, or at least evaluation judgment itself has a time thing. It seems like it's overlooking or neglecting one very important aspect of bracketing.
Does anybody want to say something to that? I could, but you may not have signed up for some random person to read you their commentary for 3 hours, right? So you may have experienced a disconnect. But I can say this. I think if we think that time is something other than the very structure of consciousness itself, then we're going to make a methodological error for Husserl. And so he is going to talk about time, and he's going to talk about memory in particular in the upcoming sections in the first meditation. So like he is going to talk about how consciousness itself as the absolutely apodictic starting point must involve its own internal time, right? That has to happen because otherwise the range of apodictic principle or content is infinitesimally small. Like it is only the present, right? And you can't build a science out of that. And so you're right, he has to critique the range of apodictic evidence according to temporality. What is interesting to me, to build off of your point, which I think is a fine one, is that expectation does not figure into his discussion here in the first meditation. It's only memory and the present, which I find strange, but we could talk more about that later. But I think you're absolutely right. But again, time cannot be a principle because we have bracketed the world, and any idea of time as outside of us would be invalid for us to hold as an absolutely certain starting point. And so he has to get there. He has to get to temporality. I'm not saying he does it correctly. I'm just saying he himself has to get there.
To me, the fact of getting to temporality, given what he says in the beginning, that, you know, he wants to keep the general idea of moving towards a science. Well, this contaminates things. It might be that you bracket and then it's like you can't say anything. That defeats his general idea, but he maybe doesn't want to go there.
I think he has to get to the subjectivity as the starting point first. But you're right. It is uncomfortably inconsistent is the wrong word, but it's let's use it. It's uncomfortably inconsistent until even the Cartesian idea of the absolute science is made second to the starting point of subjectivity itself.
Okay.
But I do. Any other questions? These are really helpful. Philip.
So I just wanted to, first of all, respond to Olga's question about how you know, if confounding phenomenon arise in a science, phenomena which confound the sort of the group intuition, how they proceed. It seems to me that one general regulative principle is coherence in understanding. So again, to talk about physics, you might have a theoretical notion of an absolute now, and that's coming from the theory side. And then on the experimental side, this is what Poincaré did, you might look at the actual experimental practices that ground experimentally the idea of a now, a shared now, and then you notice a gap between them. And then once you've discovered that gap, that gives you a direction. You can then argue, well, maybe we shouldn't hold to this theoretical idea of an absolute now. And so you can give that up. So you're looking for coherency because, say, physics, it relies on mathematics, it grounds itself on two pillars, the certainty of mathematical deduction and on the certainty that we get through standardized experimental procedures and all kinds of safeguards which allow intersubjective agreement at the experimental level. But if we can find incoherence across that, that can lead us forward. And then I have a question of my own, which is, on reading these first sections, I was really struck by how much emphasis Husserl puts on certainty. And I was kind of surprised based on my prior experience of picking up Husserlian thinking. It seems to me that, I don't know, that seems to be strangely misplaced, if I can just be so blunt, because, I mean, certainly in 300 years of scientific development, we've seen repeated overthrows of what appeared to be certainties. I mean, for example, Newtonian mechanics was based on what we thought was a certain foundation, and Euclidean geometry, for example, and then it was overthrown. And I think that's certainly made physicists as a group feel that it's sort of unwise to sort of keep on looking, believing that there exist certain foundations. What we try to do is instead find relatively secure foundations, but always keep this humbleness that we really don't know. We really don't know. And so I was rather struck by that, by Husserl's attitude, at least as it came across in these meditations. And so part of my question to you, Peter, is that a generic attitude you think that he has throughout his life, or is that particularly at this phase of life when he was writing this?
I mean, that's a big question that people can approach Husserl, the Husserl scholarship approaches in different ways. I think he maintains the same position all the way through his works. And I think in the crisis of the European sciences, he is more than ever concerned with the way in which the mathematizable has become a kind of certainty that, though they may be humble, the science, and I'm not making fun of that. I mean, I just think he would say it this way. Though they may be humble, they rely on this as if it is a certainty that the life world, the bumpy life world, is able to be governed by mathematizable functions and principles. And so, yeah, I don't think he's looking for it as in the sense of like you would be on a boat and you'd be trying to find the things on the shoreline that you could see. I think he's discovering that science itself seeks this point of absolute certainty. And so he says, how do we then understand what would be built into this humble striving? And he says, well, the point of certainty, once I bracket the very question of whether the world exists independently of me, which science takes for granted, right? Science wants to say, hey, these things out there, they have these laws governing them. It doesn't matter what I think. They just have these laws, right? And so he says, well, if I bracket that big assumption, what am I left with? I am actually left with an apodictic certainty about my own consciousness. And so in a way, it looks like he's searching for something. He's put it over there. And then he goes, oh, look, I found this thing I already put over there. But I think for him, he really means that he has been able to take science seriously and say, if you need an absolutely certain starting point, here's the one that appears. But at any rate, that's a great question.
Well,
I know that people want to continue talking. I need to ask Julia, how long were you going to present on 7 and 8? I just want to know beforehand.
Gonna do about between 10 and 15 minutes.
Okay, so Julia, what would you like to do? We can talk about these sections probably for the remainder of the time today and start with you next time, or you could go now and then we could end with however many minutes of questions and then can pick up again with you. Like, what do you want to do? Do you want to save it or do you want to do it today?
Uh, if you want to end right at 2, I suppose we wouldn't have enough time for questions. What do you?
Are you willing to come back next time and present? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Then why don't we do that? We'll start with you next time. We'll continue our discussion now because I know that people like Jeremy and Olga at least wanted to say things. And then before we leave, maybe 3 more volunteers to do some presenting with Julia next week on sections of the second meditation. Does that seem okay? That way we can talk further about what's going on. All right. Thank you, Julia. I just wanted to, because she prepared, right? So I didn't want to override that, but I think this is a better way forward. So Jeremy and then Olga.
I was very interested in what Philip had to say. I guess, and I liked your answer, Peter, as well. Just some other observations. I think and I think I'm right about this, but I think it's important to remember that the kinds of certainties that Husserl says even science is striving for are not within what we would normally consider to be a scientific result. It's not a part of physics. The kind of certainty that even physics depends on is not a part of physics, at least in the way that the science of physics is normally concerned. That the apodicticity of subjectivity, the apodictic laws according to which any experience at all, is fashioned. People don't normally think of that as physics. And yet Husserl is also saying there's something within science that demands that. And so Husserl is not talking about the certainty of scientific procedures. Even that is revisable. He's talking about, like, especially in Crisis of the European Sciences, he's talking about how scientific procedures are rooted in a level of experience of the life world that's prior to those procedures. The simple fact that we can hear the clicking of the detectors in the double slit experiment, and things like that. That for all of the high-level inferences made on the basis of experiment, they all come back to our embodied existence in the world and our senses, and you can't get away from that. That's the kind of certainty, or the certainty that involves, or how to evaluate how we know things like that. That's what Husserl really is focusing on, I think.
I think that's right. And I think the other point about the life world, and I know this isn't the book that we're doing, but it's important that people remember that for him, Husserl, the life world is that out of which sciences arise, right? So they arise out of bumpy, irregular, experiential system. And the life world also pulls them back in. So I literally see through the optics of Descartes, right? I literally have science pulled into, as close as possible, into my body, and I learn to live according to the way science unfolds. So that's for him why it would be so important for science to be grounded on the science of meaning that the life world presents to us. And so I think Ronnie's earlier question about, metaphysics and her discussion, like, meaning is central to metaphysics. It's not other than metaphysics, it's central to it. And so if science is trying to enact systems of knowing that have some sort of perfectibility, not they can't actually be perfect, but perfectibility, that must be drawn from some source that is already the grounding for the very project of knowing. If there is no grounding for the project of knowing, then we are involved in such a humiliating self-contradiction that like everything is meaningless. That's why existentialism might be true. And so I think that's why Husserl must be consistent with this, finding this certain point all the way through, because meaning must be preserved as what it presents itself to be. So anyway, that I think, Jeremy, you're right. Olga, go ahead.
Thank you. Oh, thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Peter. I want to wind it back to possible limit of certainty in Husserl. And I think it also relates to Philip's question. When it gets to passive synthesis, I think that Husserl struggles with certainty in analysis of passive synthesis. First of all, I mean, in that book, it's very unclear whether this is an account of a categorical intuition or there is some kind of transcendental deduction involved. In other words, it's unclear what's exactly the foundation is for his argument, and then there is no certain argument. You can find through that book even contradictions. For example, the way he starts defining doubt as competition for a certain hyletic stock of particular ideas. So anyway, I think that the certainty is based on visibility, and as soon as it gets to a complex of things or processes which are invisible, then we retreat to some kind of logical or eidetic categorical operation. And the genetics of certainty here becomes very, very problematic. So I think that there is a limit. There is a limit to which certainty of evidence can take us. And then we have to start relying on something else. Yep.
Evan, yeah.
More of a clarification question, especially as we go forward. You mentioned in your notes there that we're already seeing givenness, or the thing that is given as being important to these concepts. And of course, coming from sort of the religious experience side and theology, the idea of the gift is such a loaded religious concept in most religious traditions, particularly in the fact that it implies ethical responsibility. When you are given something, you are required through various means to respond to that in good or bad ways. An ethics is created there. I don't know if that, I don't think that's what Husserl is doing. I know that the theological turn of phenomenology by some authors will start moving that way. And so just to clarify, so I read this text correctly without importing those other things. When Husserl is talking about the givenness that we get from the sciences, that it's working on given fact, I think section 3 particularly has this clearly laid out. Is there an ethical component that is brought in at that moment that cannot be extricated from the givenness? Or I guess more specifically, what does Husserl mean by given in that quality? What's being put in with that?
Ronnie, I know you want to respond. Go ahead.
I think Husserl is here a very strict secular philosopher. I mean, the whole theological turn named after Marion, Jean-Luc Marion, and others is and Levinas is something totally alien to Husserl in the way I see it. Although I would say, and this is actually, I think, deserve attention maybe in one of the SoPheRE's conferences, Husserl's attitude to theology, which is something different. And if you look up his many letters to priests and other religious figures, you see how troubled and so many complexities he carries in this regard regarding the theology. And we know that many of his important students, such as Max Scheler, Konrad Martius, Edith Stein, Hildebrand, so many of them were converted to Christianity, and he himself, we know, he was converted, but his attitude towards religion and towards theology was really in a great need of elaboration, and I would say even psychoanalytic therapy, just to go to the bottom why he was so much. He confessed in one of his letter to the priest Badin that he wrote, he established or composed phenomenology for people like him that don't have this religious belief. I mean, for those who have this religious belief, they probably don't need phenomenology, but he needed because he doesn't have this approach to religious belief, and he wrote actually this. He did that. He established this phenomenology for people like him. And just to comment, I mean, I wonder what he would say about our AI era when all is mathematized. I mean, we would actually jealous his time when this did not happen yet. And now we are in a situation that it appears that we completely lost the battle. I mean, and I don't know who will save us from this era. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's important. There's one thing that I don't disagree with Ronnie, and she knows better than I do all of the different letters and these insights. But I will say, Evan, that I do believe there is inherent ethical responsibility that he's talking about with respect to givenness. And it's not religious, but it is in this sense. We are already given more than we are able to be responsible for. We see wholes by means of parts, but we are given the wholes inadequately, yet fully. I have the table in view, and I mean the table, even though I really only have one perspectival slice. And so I think Husserl is, to go back to Philip's point, our job is to become increasingly adequate to the responsibility that we have already been given. And we've been given it as a kind of intertwining of subject and object. So I think if there is a beginning to theology, it lies in the very structure of consciousness. So at any rate, I also think if people want to read about that, Heidegger's very early essay on phenomenology and theology would perhaps be in contact with Husserl on the role of the given. Olga, and then we need to schedule.
Just very brief comment.
Yeah.
In Husserliana, volume 42, there is a compilation of Husserl's study of limit phenomena, and it's specifically on his ideas about religion, which he grounds on evidence, and also the recent work by Emiliano Trisio is specifically dedicated to theology in Husserl.
And Jim Hart, too, would be
And
another.
Jim Hart, of course, yeah.
Yeah. All right, so my thought is we'll start with Julia next time with 7 and 8, then discuss her presentation. I can continue with 9 through 11, and then maybe I'll also do 12 to 14 just to start the second meditation. Are there 3 people who would be willing to do 6 sections for next time? Sally, you want to do 15 and 16?
Okay.
Anybody else want to do any? Should I be looking at the
No,
chat? You want to do 17 and 18, Jeremy?
Okay.
Anybody want to do 19 and 20? 15 to 20-minute presentation. It does not have to be exhaustive. It can be whatever format you would like. It can be a slideshow. It can be, as long as you can share your screen. It can be bullet points. It can be questions. It can just be reflections where you apply it. It does not have to be exhaustive.
I can take 19 and 20 on the second meditations.
All right.
Okay.
Go ahead, Olga. Yeah.
Peter, be sure that we leave a minute for organizational things at the end.
Next time or this time?
No, now, because regarding the mailing list, maybe sending commentaries, etc.
So me and you mean, as opposed to everybody else?
No, everybody. I will need emails from the group to put together a mailing list for the webinar. And yeah.
Okay. So just to remind myself, Sally is 15 and 16, Jeremy is 17 and 18, Evan is 19 and 20. If if things happen, sometimes we get sick or we have to be called out of town, just let me know as quickly as you can, and I will produce something not as good as I'm sure what you'll do, but I'll do my best. But that would be great. Aim for 15 to 20 minutes. Aim for questions, and whatever you find that's interesting in these sections. Is this okay? Is everyone okay with this format as we are doing it?
So how many sections are we going to?
So my goal would be to do all of the second meditation. Whether we get through all of them is probably not, right? So Julia, for sure, 7 and 8. I'll read 9 through 11. That's the end of the first meditation. I will try to be shorter for the first 3 sections so that Sally can plan on going, and then Jeremy and Evan. But I think reading the whole second meditation would be good so that you have a perspective on the parts that will be said. If you can't, come anyway. Just, err on the side of listening and talking than not. So, Olga, you would like everyone to have, you want to have everyone's email.
Yes, that would be desirable if people want to continue with this group, then we need some kind of communication device.
So would it be okay if everybody put their email address in the chat to you?
Not in the chat, it better by email, and I'm putting my email
Yeah, do that.
Here.
What is that?
So Olga has put her email address in the chat, and I see Benjamin put the article by Steinbach, which is excellent.
Where is that? What? Excuse me. What is that? I didn't notice the chat. What is that? This article?
Which Steinbach is it, Benjamin?
It's an article regarding the notion of evidence, and it relates to the concept of religion experience, religious experience. But there is another article that I tried to look for. Maybe I'm pretty sure that it talks specifically about Husserl.
Maybe you can send it.
Yes, maybe, I don't know, next week.
Send it as an attachment because it doesn't allow to download it.
Okay, I'll look for it because I know I have it. So just give me a week, maybe next week I can give it to you. Could it be that way?
Yes, that's fine.
And what is that? Emiliano Trizio? What is that? Okay.
Trizio is okay. Trizio wrote recently on Husserl's theology. It's part of his work on Husserl's metaphysics. And Whole 42 is the whole volume on limit phenomena, and there is a lot on idea of God and evidence. I can send you a paper on this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So everybody, please send your email to Olga. Even if you sent it to me, please send it to Olga. And I'm assuming that the link will be very similar. It may be the same, but I'm not sure. So Olga will send you.
It's pretty much the same.
Yeah, I think you can just click on the same one.
Yes.
Does anyone have any? Go ahead, sorry.
Sorry, could you then send the materials on email to all of us,
Well,
Olga?
that's why yes, I can,
Yeah,
but
okay.
that's why I need emails.
Mm-hmm.
We'll put together, there is a webinar listserv, and we'll have communications, and I'll send all the links, everything, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Feel free
So
to
one
email
question.
us with questions too or concerns.
Yeah, yes, regarding recordings, regarding the format of the webinar, and you can email Peter, you can email me directly. I'll be happy to talk with you either privately or on the group email. So yeah. Mhm.
Philip, yeah.
So just a quick question. Are we meeting, sorry, is it every week or every 2 weeks? I
Every
missed
2
that.
weeks.
2
Every
weeks.
2 weeks. Okay,
Okay,
okay.
great. Thank you.
It should give us enough time to do the second meditation.
Okay, but be sure that I have everybody's email, please, so that we kind of get it all straight.
All right. Well, thank
So
you.
March 5th, the next
So
one is March.
5th. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
March 5th.
12 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the United States.
Okay.
So it should be a Wednesday.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, Peter, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. I really learned a lot, and I'll be trying
you.
to talk to the things that you've been speaking about. All right. Thank you, Julia, for waiting for a week.
Thank you.
You.
Yeah, thank you.